You're listening to the Deep End Podcast, a ministry of Hermitage Church, where we have a conversation about Sunday's sermon and chat about ways we can go a little deeper in our faith. I'm Hunter Steinmetz, and I'm one of the pastors here at our church. Every week, we will listen in on a conversation with the preacher from this week about deeper theological pieces of the sermon and suggested practices on how we can embody this word and allow it to seep into our skin. We hope that this podcast will become a part of your weekly faith journey on your drive into work, as you do the dishes, or as you sip your coffee on Tuesday mornings. Thanks for jumping into the deep end with us. Let's listen in on this week's conversation. Welcome to the Deep End. I'm Hunter.
I'm Brad.
And we're here this week to talk about Palm Sunday, which is this coming Sunday. And the text for Sunday is Luke 19, 28 through 40. But we're not going to spend so much time specifically in that text. We're going to spend more time in the historical background of Palm Sunday. Why the palms? Brad and I actually had somebody from church on Ash Wednesday ask us, why is it called Palm Sunday? Which is a great question. And our answer was, well, because of the palms. And he was like, well, I knew that. But it really is like this podcast should help us kind of have a better framework. Why the palms? Are the palms significant? And what does the whole triumphal entry thing kind of mean? So that's where we're spending most of our time today.
Thanks for joining us as we prepare for Palm Sunday by taking a deep dive into some what can be surprising connections, probably some connections you haven't maybe even heard before, I would say. We will notice these links between Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and this connection to what is called the Maccabean Revolt.
So this one's going to challenge the way that we think about Palm Sunday, and I think a good and healthy way. It will give us a better context for what's happening and some of the tensions that Palm Sunday brings for people following Christ. We all know the scene. Jesus is riding in on a donkey, and there's palm branches waving from everywhere. They're cutting them down off the trees, and they're waving the palms just as we will do on Sunday. And the people are shouting, Hosanna! And it feels a whole lot like a celebration, right?
Yeah, and that is what is really interesting is that we probably often think of it as a celebration, and in our modern context, it is a celebration. But in this ancient context, when we swim around in that world and breathe in their ideas, it actually was more about revolution.
Yeah, and there is some praise and worship to it, but their praise and worship is rooted in revolution.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly where today's episode is headed, because when we look at this moment through the lens of the Maccabean Revolt, we see that the crowd is not just trying to welcome a Messiah like we understand them to. They were actually projecting their revolutionary hopes onto Jesus, maybe even nationalistic hopes onto Jesus, that Israel can become a world power again. And that completely reshapes how we will engage with the liturgy of Palm Sunday this Sunday.
So to understand this historical backdrop more accurately, we have to go back about 200 years before Jesus to set the stage for this moment. So now we'll kind of move back into that time frame and explore the world.
So to really get at what's happening on Palm Sunday, we have to go back to 167 BCE, which is just before Common Era, which is kind of centered around Jesus' death is when they made the calendar. So it's about 160, 150, 200 years before Jesus is around. And the Jewish people were under the thumb of the Seleucid Empire. And if you remember back a couple podcasts ago, probably 4 weeks ago when we really talked about the Pharisees, we talked about how the progression of the movement of God's people in this story, that now we've talked some about the Hasmonean family, and so this is kind of where we find ourselves in that story. And if you want to go back, it's the Pharisees episode, if it will give you a little bit more context. But the Seleucid Empire's ruler is Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and he was a brutal leader, and he did not just oppress the people, but he was actively trying to erase Jewish identity.
And it was in a very outright way. He outlawed circumcision, banned the Torah, and even more so, he desecrated the temple in Jerusalem. He actually brought a pig into the temple and sacrificed it on an altar, putting up a statue of Zeus in the Holy of Holies.
And the pig, the significance of that is that it's an unclean animal. And this was like, you don't, like, how could you possibly do this? So as you can imagine, this is not sitting well with the Jewish people who are living in this region who have been occupied by the Seleucid Empire. And so enter now a character named Mattathias, who is a rural priest who was not interested in anything that the Seleucids were doing. And he and his 5 sons launched this kind of grassroots guerrilla revolt. And when Mattathias dies, his son, Judah Maccabee, sometimes referred to as Judas Maccabeus, he takes over, and he really kind of fights in a, it's this like grassroots guerrilla revolution in order to try and get their nation back. And over the next few years, he leads this actually kind of stunning military campaign to actually push back the Seleucids. He drives out the Seleucids in 3 years. By 164. The Jews reclaim and rededicate the temple, and it's this huge political revolution that they have taken their land back, and it's a really big deal for the people.
But the story doesn't end with the temple, does it?
No, not at all. The Maccabees were not just about restoring worship. Their hopes really were nationalistic. They were about reclaiming Jewish sovereignty. They wanted Israel to kind of go back to like the Davidic dynasty, where they were actually a major player in the world, where people feared them. They had power. They had a military. They wanted to be a name to be revered in the world, kind of going back to Genesis 11. If you're in the Genesis class on Wednesday nights, they wanted to make a name for themselves. And so the Hasmonean family, or the Maccabean revolt, establishes a dynasty that rules for about 100 years, and then come in the Romans.
So by the time of Jesus, the Maccabean revolt wasn't just history. It was a national symbol of what it meant to fight for God's kingdom. But what about a people living under Roman occupation?
For that people living under Roman occupation, the memory of the Maccabees was not just kind of an inspiration. It was this like fuel for revolutionary hope. So if we can if we can kind of walk through history, the Seleucid Empire, which is a Greek empire, they come in and they take over the land that we understand as Israel. The Maccabean revolt pushes them back, and they have some sovereignty for a while until the Romans come and take over again. And so now you enter scene. Jesus is born, and the Roman Empire is there. I want us to talk about, there's a theologian from kind of the early to mid 1900s named Howard Thurman. And in his book, Jesus and the Disinherited, which is a really wonderful book about how God chooses to become incarnate, to be made flesh in minority populations, in a population of poor people. He talks in that book, he talks about. I'll just read you this paragraph. So this is Howard Thurman. In Galilee, a certain revolutionary whose name was Judas. This is not Judas Maccabeus, by the way. It's a different guy because this is Jesus' time. He laid siege to the armory at Sepphoris with weapons taken there and tried to reestablish the political glory of Israel. How terrible a moment. The whole city of Sepphoris was regarded as a hostage, and Roman soldiers, aided by the warriors of King Aretas of Arabia, reduced the place to a whited ash. In the time the city was rebuilt, and perhaps Jesus was one of the carpenters employed from Nazareth, which was a neighboring village. So if we set the stage for like what is even happening in Jesus' life, just as a human being, as a boy growing up in Nazareth, there is like an Israel history of like the Maccabeans, 100, 150 years before Jesus is alive. But then even just like 4 miles over from Jesus' boyhood home, there is this, there's a revolt from Jewish rebels, again, trying to push back the Romans. And the Romans are just so powerful. They're like, if you're going to rush our armory, we're just going to burn the whole city down. But Howard Thurman talks about it's possible that because Joseph was a carpenter, that Jesus and Joseph may have helped rebuild the city. Not in a spiritual sense, but just in like that was their job.
Yeah.
That was their trade. So it's wild to think that all of these Galileans may be building furniture together and going, "Ugh, those Romans, like they burned our city down." You know, you're just angry, and it's building. You just get more angry and more angry and more angry. So there's lots of these stories where like the Jews do not like the Romans, and even as Jesus as a boy, if you take the like God part of him away, not that you really can, but if you focus really on his humanity. Jesus is not separated from like a really deep distaste for the Romans because he's watched them be brutal his entire life. So when we fast forward 200 years, so now so that was when we like 150 years before Jesus. Then Jesus as a boy in this revolt 4 miles over from his town, which actually shows up in Acts 5 as 37 or 38.
37.
37. Then now Jesus is riding in on a donkey. 200 years later, Jesus is riding into Jerusalem, and what do the people do? It's what we'll do on Sunday. They wave palm branches and they shout Hosanna.
Yeah, I don't know if we mentioned this either, but their coinage too, the palm branches, is that okay? Yeah, I was thinking of like the like it's all so symbolic, everything that's happening, and this is like this part of the story where we're moving into right now, where Jesus is actually moving into the city with the backdrop of all that's happened and all the tension, and that beautiful image of Jesus potentially being a restorative, and him and Joseph being restorative in the city. And now this moment where they're moving into the city, and the palm branches, they weren't just random kind of symbols or shrubbery or greenery. They were these symbols of Jewish victory and freedom.
Yeah, so this is a huge piece that is so easy to miss on Palm Sunday. So everyone, like if you're listening to this, I really want you to dig in right here. After the Maccabean revolt, when they get their own independence again, palm branches are stamped onto their coins as a symbol of Jewish nationalism. So the palm branches are like huge. It's not just that they happened to cut them down and use them because that was what was there. The people are holding up palm branches, and the Romans know what the palm branches mean because they got rid of those coins. So when the people are waving the palm branches at Jesus, they aren't just celebrating. They're saying, I think Judah Maccabee is back. And the same thing's going to happen. We're going to push the Romans back into the sea. We're going to get our land back. Like, here he comes. Except it's a little bit different.
Which makes so much sense with all that's been discussed. And these people had been waiting for another Maccabean-type Messiah, someone who would come in with power, who would drive out the Romans and reclaim the kingdom.
Because all throughout, like the divided kingdom after Saul, David, and Solomon, you have northern kings, southern kings. They're evil. They get swallowed up by Assyria and Babylon, the Seleucids and Rome. I mean, it's just constant. They deeply desire to be their own nation with a king, even though God said you don't want a king. They want it so badly. They're saying, take us back to the days when King David was our king and things were good and the world feared us. And then here comes Jesus, and he's riding in, not on a war horse, a stallion, with a sword, with armor. He is on a donkey, a foal.
It's like when I hear that, it's almost kind of laughable.
Yeah, I mean, what is this?
Yeah, I imagine like Jesus' head kind of drooped down as he's riding in.
And that's actually a great point because, again, Jesus isn't like, I mean, people aren't like bowing down like in the movies, like, oh, here's our king. They're saying like, here is the revolutionary.
Yeah.
He's going to, I mean, this is crude, but this is what they're thinking. He's going to go cut Caesar's head off. I mean, like, we're taking our land back. And Jesus is walking, or he's not walking, he's riding the donkey going, oh, you guys, no, that's not it.
Yeah, it's so good. And it goes directly back to Zechariah 9:9. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation, humble and mounted on a donkey.
So when the people are waving branches, thinking Maccabean revolution, Jesus is riding a donkey, signaling Zechariah's peaceful king.
And that's where the tension starts to build. The people are shouting, Hosanna, which means save us now. But what they mean is save us from Rome.
Yeah. But Jesus is not coming to overthrow Rome. He's coming to overthrow and overturn sin and death. And that's a different kind of victory and a different kind of battle, even though I don't really love battle metaphors.
Yeah. Yeah. It is tricky. I always have difficulty with that too. So I guess kind of asking different questions like what could this mean for us and how we engage with Palm Sunday today?
I think for starters, it means that Palm Sunday, although it is a celebration that our Savior has come, when you put this lens on it, knowing that this is what the people thought, that it's not just a celebration. It is a moment that is filled with lots of tension and misunderstanding.
When we cry out, Hosanna today, we're not asking Jesus to fit into what we want or our own agendas similar to what the people wanted against Rome, but instead we're surrendering to the agenda of God.
Yeah, and that's a super hard shift. And Palm Sunday kind of forces us to ask, are we following Jesus for who he is, or are we following him because we're trying to pigeonhole him into the God that we actually want him to be?
The same crowd that shouted Hosanna would later in Holy Week shout crucify him because Jesus didn't fit their vision of what a Messiah would be.
Yeah, and I've actually heard, this is kind of an aside, but I've heard a theory that says it's possible that there are two different camps, that there's a camp who actually believed that he was the Messiah in a healthy way. And then the other people, because it happened so early in the night, crucify him, that those people were still up in their camps, up in Bethany where the poor lived. But either way, the story goes, and it doesn't really matter who's saying it, it's that there's misplaced expectations on Jesus. And then when he doesn't fight back and when he doesn't stick up for himself, it's like, all right, just get this. There's no way that Israel gets its power and its kingdom back with a guy who rides a donkey and lets people slap him. This is not how it goes. So when we wave our palm branches this year on this Sunday, I think that we should live in the tension of waving it. It asks us, Palm Sunday asks us, what kind of king do we think that we are welcoming? Is it a king who meets our expectations, or is it a king who turns them upside down? So as we head into Holy Week, let's not just wave our palm branches and move on. Let's kind of sit in that tension and recognize how easy it is to celebrate the Jesus that we want him to be and still miss the entire point.
So as we move through Palm Sunday, it's not just about singing Hosanna. It's about choosing whether we'll follow Jesus, and we, as in the church, locally,
collective.
Locally and globally, will follow Jesus all the way to the cross.
Yeah. So as we wrap up, I really hope that you this is not something that is kind of like a cute thing that we found. That this is the understanding. The palm branches are symbols of political revolution, and that it's not really what Jesus is interested in doing. So much more than just political revolution, even though that is in some ways what happens. It's so much bigger than what the people wanted. So thanks for joining us this week on the Deep End Podcast. We are super excited to be with you on Palm Sunday, to say Hosanna together and to live in the tension of kind of those two worlds and misunderstandings. So we'll be back next week as we move closer and closer to the cross. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks.